Hey everybody! It's been a while since I've been on live, but now that everyone is back in the swing of school, I thought that I would jump on here and talk about something that's going to be affecting a lot of little ones this school year, maybe not so little, and that's fractions. So, what I've noticed as an educator, as I've gained experience in this world, is that fractions are really tough for American elementary schoolers. It seems like across the board, kiddos tend to have trouble with fractions, maybe more than other math concepts. It is one of those stumbling blocks that I see a lot with kids. A lot of kids are stumbling with the fractions. It ranks up there with the multiplication and the division. Fractions are just something that seems to trip a lot of kids up. And so, like, raise your hand or hand emoji or whatever you want to do if fractions were painful for you when you were a kid. Because I know they were kind of painful for me. And I didn't really understand what they meant probably until I was a little bit too old, maybe. But when I was like in third grade, when we started to learn to add and subtract and multiply and divide fractions, that concept was difficult for me. So I was right there, and I see kids come to me a lot with issues learning how to do things with these fractions. And so for a lot of kids, it can seem like it goes from 0 to 100, just like that, because Crystal, I don't know. Maybe you like my page. If not, I'm sorry. But it seems like it goes from 0 to 100 for these kids because in younger grades you're learning what fractions are, right? You're getting those little circle diagrams that are split in half and talking about 1/2 and 2/3 and things like that. So we go from that in the younger grades, understanding kind of what a fraction actually is, so splitting those wholes into different parts and talking about, 1/2, 2/3, things like that. And then going into adding fractions and subtracting fractions, and then going from that to multiplying and dividing fractions. For some kids, that can be super overwhelming. So, going from that, it seems like when we're talking about adding and subtracting fractions, we jump into these pizza models. So, a lot of times you'll talk to kids about pizza to get them into fractions, which is awesome because I love pizza. And that would definitely get me into fractions. I even ate pizza at my wedding. That's what we served. So I am such a fan of pizza. I'm not as much of a fan of pizza when it comes to fractions. It's a good real life application. But with fractions, pizza, it can only go so far. I see that there are a couple of you guys watching. How often do you have to use fractions to do things with pizza? And so a lot of the times we'll get kids into fractions with pizza, which is great, because they understand that concept. They've cut a pizza before, or they've seen somebody cut a pizza, into sixths, or they've seen them cut it into eighths, which is normal, but you can't really, who really cuts a pizza into fourths? Unless it's a really small personal pizza, I guess. You could. But the other thing that I have an issue with is that pizza is hard to draw the diagrams correctly once you get past a certain number. Or even in the low numbers, like thirds. Thirds is okay to draw, but that's not going to be super accurate. Going into things like fifths. That's hard to draw on a pizza. So our pizza diagrams can only take us so far. And so what I would suggest maybe when you're explaining fractions to your kids is to use a square diagram like that, or even to use a number line and split it into like numbers, so 0, 1, 2, and then within those whole numbers split it into your fraction. So this would be a thirds, because there's 3, this is fourths, sorry, because it's split into 4 sections within that whole number. That's going to help your child get a better concept of what that fraction actually means. And then, so the reason we want this idea of a fraction to be so solid in our kids' brain is because once we start to actually try to do things with fractions, it's going to be harder if they don't understand what the fraction actually means. So when we're adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing fractions, if we don't understand what they actually look like, what it actually means, what it looks like on a number line, it's going to be super difficult for kids to understand why we do what we do with fractions. So a lot of times they struggle with knowing when to make the denominator same on the bottom. A lot of that confusion gets eased up if they understand what fractions look like and why you can't add 2/4 to 3/5, because the denominator is not the same. Those pieces aren't the same size, and you can't add them together. Another thing that I use to help my kids get a better idea of what fractions look like are these little guys. So they're fraction tiles, and it comes with a hole, so 1, and then the little fraction tiles that you can use to visually represent what that fraction looks like. So it has like 6 and 8s and things like that. And so it's helpful for demonstrating why we need to have that common denominator. These are on Amazon, and they're pretty cheap too. And so if your child is having a lot of issues with fractions, I would suggest these. These are really cool. I know they make magnetic ones too, I think, and on the back of mine they have decimals as well, which is another tricky concept, but if you understand fractions, it's easier to understand decimals. So I would highly suggest getting some of these if your child is stumbling on the fraction. And I know I tend to get so long-winded on these live sessions, but to put into context why it's so important for students to understand how fractions actually work before they get into what we call the standard algorithm. So basically how you tell kids to do the problem, such as, for adding, make the denominators the same and then add the tops. That would be the standard algorithm. So I'm going to give an example of why it's so important to go and actually make sure your child understands exactly what that looks like. So exactly what adding fractions looks like, or exactly what multiplying fractions look like. I'm going to use division because it's the biggest, hairiest beast, I feel like, for kids who are learning how to do things with fractions. I got to grab my eraser. I didn't get that out. So you recall, when you're dividing a fraction, you're told to take the division problem. So if we're going to use our division problem, I'm going to look at what I've gotten written down here. I wrote down the problem beforehand. Like 3 divided by 1/3. When you're doing that problem in school, students are told to keep this number the same and then flip the second one. I know this is going to be, and so you're flipping the 1/3. So 3 divided by 1/3, you're going to flip the 1/3, take its reciprocal, and then you're going to multiply the whole thing together. So then it would turn into 3 times 3 over 1, which is 3. But kids get so confused. They're like, well, why am I flipping this? And then why am I changing the sign? Like, normally it's not okay for me to change the sign. So that's kind of crazy for them, right? And so they actually have to see what dividing fractions look like. And so with this problem, I could show a multitude of things, but I would show maybe a number line. So we draw a number line and then have 0, 1, 2, and 3. And then so we're dividing 3 by 1/3. And so a lot of times when we think about division, we think about how many can go into that number. So when we're dividing whole numbers, dividing 10 by 2, we say how many times can 2 go into 10? And this is the same thing. How many times can 1/3 go into 3? And so we're going to split it up into 1/3 and see how many 1/3 can go into 3. And so we would divide, put our little tick marks to make each whole into thirds. And then we'd see how many thirds can go into 3. So that'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 9 thirds can go into 3. And so this starts to make a little bit more sense, because we are 1/3 is going to go into 3 times more than a whole number. So like we multiplied, there were 3/3 in each whole. And so that's why we would multiply by 3. That's why we flip that fraction, if that makes sense. I know I got a little bit stumbled up there trying to explain that. So that's why we take the reciprocal. And using a problem this is pretty simple problem. Using a problem like this can help students understand how to do this problem when we have hairier fractions. Like, so if we were going to take like 3/4 divided by 1/2. That can be a little hairier because it's harder to show on a number line. It's harder to draw with like a box diagram, right? And so that's why we need to show our children these things so that they really start to understand the concept of fractions. And I know it's easier said than done. This is so abstract, and it's maybe the first really abstract thing that kids encounter. And so I think it's like one of the things that we really need to pay attention to. And so you can also do a lot of pointing out fractions in real life whenever you can. So like when you're baking, looking at that, measuring cup and seeing the tick marks and how they split up that cup. And talking about, well, we get a 1/2 gallon of milk. What does that mean? What if we got 2 half-gallons of milk? Or how could we split this cereal into fourths? Just talking about those math concepts all the time will also help ease that transition into being able to do these complex operations with fractions, which I know can be such a stumbling point for kids. And also, if you have any questions about how to approach these fractions with your child, send me a message or a comment on here. I'd love to answer your questions for you. And if more instructional videos would help, I'm more than willing to do those as well, because this is my passion and I want kids to not stumble on fractions like I did, and like I know many of you did growing up in school. It just can be so, abstract. And so memorizing these ways to add, subtract, multiply, divide fractions can be a lot simpler if your child knows what fractions look like and how those operations look when you're physically doing them or drawing them. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit today because I know that kids are doing a lot of review right now. It may be coming up that fractions are going to be part of the curriculum for your child this year. And I just wanted you to know it doesn't have to be a struggle if you address some things like the basic concepts. So I'm going to try to link my fraction tiles in the comments. It's not an affiliated link or anything, so you can shop around on Amazon or wherever you like to get your things to get those fraction tiles so that you can let your child play with them. Even just like your kid playing with the tiles will help them understand better how those work. I see that you struggled with fractions. Yeah, I think almost everyone did. I haven't met too many people who say that they love fractions. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut this video off. I feel like I've been a little bit long-winded again. I need to figure out how to get my video time down here. But if you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I'll try to link things that are helpful for fractions as well, games, things like that. And I hope everyone's having a great start to their school year. So I'll see you guys soon.